Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to walk you through a significant development that unfolded just hours ago in Tokyo, one that could reshape the global balance of power in critical technology and defense sectors for years to come. What we witnessed at the Akasaka Palace represents not just a diplomatic meeting between two leaders, but potentially a turning point in how the world's democracies respond to economic coercion and strategic vulnerability. President Donald Trump met with Japan's newly appointed Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in what can only be described as a historic encounter. The significance begins with Takaichi herself. She is Japan's first female prime minister in the nation's entire history, having taken office just last week. This is a country with one of the lowest rates of female political representation among developed nations, where women hold only about 10% of parliamentary seats. For Japan to elevate a woman to its highest office represents a seismic shift in Japanese political culture. Trump himself acknowledged this milestone during their joint appearance, calling it a big deal and predicting she will go down as one of the great prime ministers. Now, you might be cynical about such praise coming from Trump, who has a well-documented history of saying whatever serves his immediate diplomatic interests. But the body language and the substance of their interaction suggested something more than mere flattery. There was genuine mutual respect on display. Trump praised Takaichi's very strong handshake, which might sound trivial but actually matters in the world of high-stakes diplomacy where every gesture is analyzed. He declared the United States an ally at the strongest level with Japan, using language that goes beyond the usual diplomatic boilerplate. In return, Takaichi made a stunning announcement. She intends to nominate Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, citing his peacemaking efforts in mediating conflicts, including the Thailand-Cambodia ceasefire and the recent Gaza agreement. Now, whether Trump deserves a Nobel Prize is a debate for another day, and frankly, the Nobel Committee operates independently of such nominations. But the gesture itself is revealing. Takaichi is signaling to both domestic and international audiences that she sees Trump not as an erratic disruptor, but as a potential force for stability. That framing will shape how other Asian leaders approach their own relationships with Washington. Let me now turn to what actually happened in that palace today, because two major agreements were signed, and it's the second one that carries the most strategic weight. The rare earths and critical minerals framework represents a direct challenge to China's near monopoly over these essential materials, and I want you to understand just how significant this is. Here's what you need to know. China currently controls over 90% of global rare earth processing. When I say rare earths, I'm talking about 17 elements on the periodic table that most people have never heard of. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, yttrium. These names mean nothing to the average person, but they mean everything to modern civilization. These materials are absolute necessities for smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, fighter jets, guided missiles, advanced manufacturing, medical imaging equipment, and virtually every piece of technology that defines the 21st century. You cannot build an F-35 fighter jet without rare earths. You cannot manufacture the permanent magnets that make electric vehicles viable without rare earths. You cannot produce the precision-guided munitions that define modern warfare without rare earths. And China knows this. Beijing has spent decades consolidating control over these materials, not just through mining, which they dominate, but more importantly through processing and refining, which is where the real choke point exists. China recently tightened export restrictions even further. In December of last year, they added new elements to their control list. They increased oversight of foreign producers who depend on Chinese materials for processing. They've made it clear that rare earths are not just an economic asset, but a geopolitical weapon, and they've demonstrated their willingness to use that weapon. Back in 2010, China cut off rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands. Prices skyrocketed. Industries panicked. Japan got the message. The deal signed today between the United States and Japan aims to break that stranglehold. The framework commits both nations to streamline permitting processes for mining and processing facilities. It establishes coordination mechanisms for supply chain security. It explores joint stockpiling arrangements so that temporary disruptions don't cripple entire industries. And it explicitly addresses what the agreement calls foreign trade distortions and unfair market practices. That's diplomatic language for countering China's market dominance through subsidies, environmental dumping, and strategic hoarding. Now, why does this matter right now, at this particular moment? The timing of this agreement is no coincidence. The United States currently has only one operational rare earth mine, the Mountain Pass facility in California. That mine was actually shut down for years due to environmental concerns and Chinese competition that made it economically unviable. It reopened, but it still sends most of its ore to China for processing because the United States lacks the infrastructure to do it domestically. The United States is racing to secure vital minerals for its defense systems and technology sectors. The Defense Department has identified rare earths as a critical vulnerability in multiple reports. If China were to cut off supplies tomorrow, American weapons production would face immediate constraints. Not theoretical constraints down the road, but immediate operational problems. Japan, meanwhile, has significant rare earth deposits. Some are on land, particularly in southern regions. But many of the most promising deposits are underwater on the ocean floor, which makes extraction extraordinarily difficult and expensive. Japan also has decades of experience in efficient manufacturing and materials science. What they lack is scale and the kind of partnership that can provide security guarantees and shared investment risk. Together, the United States and Japan are pooling resources and expertise to create an alternative supply chain. The agreement doesn't just cover the two countries. It's explicitly designed to bring in other partners. Trump has been actively pursuing similar agreements with Malaysia, which has significant rare earth deposits, but has struggled with Chinese investment that comes with strings attached. He's been talking to Thailand, which is trying to develop its own processing capabilities. And he's been coordinating with Australia, which has some of the world's largest rare earth reserves, but has seen its miners struggle against Chinese price competition. The pattern is clear. The administration is building a network of allied nations to reduce dependence on China. This isn't just about economics. This is about who controls the future of advanced technology and military capability. Whoever controls these materials controls innovation, defense, and economic competitiveness for the next 50 years. Let me now talk about the trade component of today's meeting, because it's impossible to separate the rare earths agreement from the broader economic relationship between the United States and Japan. The first agreement signed today focused on trade and economic cooperation. Trump described it as very fair and predicted the two countries will do tremendous trade together more than ever before. Here's the reality of the current situation. Most Japanese exports to the United States now face a 15% tariff. That's down from the 25% initially threatened when Trump took office in January, but it's still a massive increase from the virtually zero tariffs that existed under previous trade agreements. For Japanese manufacturers, especially automakers, this represents a significant cost increase that has to be absorbed either through lower profit margins or higher consumer prices. Japan exports roughly 1.4 million vehicles to the United States annually. The automotive industry accounts for about 8% of all jobs in Japan when you include parts suppliers, logistics, sales, and related services. These tariffs have real economic consequences. Japanese car exports to the United States dropped 24% in September compared to the previous year. That's not a small dip. That's a fundamental disruption to a core industry. So what did Japan get in exchange for accepting these tariffs? Access to the American market, but at a higher cost. Security guarantees, which I'll discuss in more detail shortly. And most importantly, from Trump's perspective, a commitment to massive investment in the United States. Japan has committed to a $550 billion investment package in the United States. Let that number sink in for a moment. $550 billion. That's not aid or a gift. That's investment in manufacturing facilities, research centers, infrastructure, and joint ventures. Toyota alone has announced plans to build or expand plants in Alabama, Texas, Kentucky, and Indiana. Honda, Nissan, and other Japanese companies are following suit. Critics have called this extortion. They argue that Trump is essentially forcing allied nations to pay tribute for continued market access and security commitments that the United States should provide anyway as part of its strategic interests. Supporters argue it's a fair exchange where both sides benefit. American workers get jobs, Japanese companies get access to the world's largest consumer market, and both countries reduce their vulnerability to Chinese economic coercion. The reality is probably somewhere in between. What we do know is that economic relationships are never purely economic. They're always intertwined with security, politics, and strategic calculations. As a gesture of goodwill, Takaichi arranged for Ford F-150 trucks and American-made Toyota vehicles to be prominently displayed at the Akasaka Palace during Trump's visit. It was political theater, sure, but political theater that communicated a clear message about economic partnership. Trump, speaking to U.S. troops stationed in Japan later in the day, encouraged them to buy a Toyota, highlighting the Japanese automaker's plans to invest in plants across America. It was a remarkable moment. An American president urging American service members to buy a foreign brand because that foreign company is creating American jobs. That's the kind of transactional relationship Trump has pursued throughout his presidency. Now, let me provide some broader context for this meeting because it doesn't exist in isolation. Sanae Takaichi is a close ally of the late Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister who served longer than anyone else in Japanese history. Abe had developed a strong personal relationship with Trump during his first term in office. They bonded over golf, over shared views on China, and over a transactional approach to diplomacy that prioritized concrete deals over abstract principles. Abe was assassinated in July of 2022 while giving a campaign speech. His death shocked Japan and eliminated one of the key architects of the U.S.-Japan alliance in the modern era. During this visit, Trump met with Abe's widow and was gifted artwork she created with a message of peace. It was an emotional moment that underscored the personal dimension of international relations that often gets lost in policy analysis. Takaichi has pledged to continue Abe's vision, particularly his push for Japan to accelerate its military buildup. This is a huge deal for a country that has maintained a pacifist constitution since the end of World War II. That constitution, actually written largely by American occupation authorities, restricts Japan's ability to maintain offensive military capabilities. For decades, Japan has interpreted this to mean it can have self-defense forces, but cannot project power beyond its immediate territory. That interpretation has been gradually shifting, and Abe was at the forefront of that shift. He reinterpreted the Constitution to allow for collective self-defense, meaning Japan could assist allies under attack even if Japan itself wasn't directly threatened. He increased defense spending. He pushed for the acquisition of long-range strike capabilities that blur the line between defensive and offensive weapons. Takaichi is promising to continue and accelerate this trajectory. Trump has consistently pushed for this, arguing that Japan and other allies need to take more responsibility for their own defense rather than relying on American military protection. From Trump's perspective, the United States has been subsidizing the defense of wealthy allies for decades, allowing them to spend less on military and more on economic competitiveness. There's an interesting dynamic here. Trump wants allies to spend more on defense, which means buying more weapons. And many of those weapons are made by American defense contractors. So it's not entirely altruistic. But the strategic logic does make sense. If Japan faces increasing pressure from China and North Korea, it needs the capability to respond without depending entirely on American intervention. Japan is also gifting 250 cherry trees to Washington next year to mark America's 250th anniversary. These trees will be planted along the National Mall, joining the original cherry trees gifted in 1912 that have become one of Washington's most iconic features. It's a symbolic gesture meant to reinforce what both leaders keep calling the golden age of the alliance. But let's be honest about what a golden age actually means. It doesn't mean perfect harmony. It doesn't mean absence of tensions or disagreements. What it means is alignment on core strategic interests, effective coordination on shared challenges, and a willingness to make mutual sacrifices for long-term benefits. Whether we're actually in such an age or just at the beginning of one remains to be seen. From Tokyo, Trump will travel to South Korea, where he's scheduled to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. That meeting will be absolutely fascinating to watch, especially given the rare earths, tensions I've outlined, and Trump's threat to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese imports in retaliation for Beijing's export restrictions. 1. 100% tariffs would effectively double the price of Chinese goods, making them uncompetitive in the American market. It's an extreme measure, and it's not clear whether Trump would actually follow through or whether it's a negotiating tactic. But the threat itself has gotten Beijing's attention. Chinese officials have publicly stated that such tariffs would be considered an act of economic warfare and would trigger proportional responses. What might those responses look like? China could further restrict rare earth exports, not just to the United States, but to American allies. They could target American companies operating in China through regulatory harassment, tax audits, or forced technology transfers. They could sell U.S. Treasury bonds, though that would hurt China's own financial interests. They could provide more support to countries or groups that oppose American interests around the world. The stakes are enormous, and the Trump-Xi meeting in South Korea will give us insight into whether there's any possibility of de-escalation or whether we're heading toward an even deeper economic confrontation. Keep in mind that the two leaders have a complicated history. They've praised each other publicly while implementing policies that directly undermine each other's interests. They've negotiated agreements that fell apart. They've threatened each other while maintaining diplomatic channels. Let me now outline several scenarios for where all of this leads, because prediction requires considering multiple possibilities rather than assuming a single inevitable outcome. Scenario 1 is what I'll call the alliance holds and expands. In this scenario, the U.S.-Japan partnership successfully develops alternative rare earth supply chains over the next 5 to 10 years. Mining operations come online in the United States, Australia, and other allied nations. Processing facilities are built, probably in Japan, South Korea, and possibly the United States. Investment dollars flow as promised. Technology sharing arrangements work smoothly. Environmental and permitting challenges are overcome faster than expected. Other countries join the framework. South Korea, which is heavily dependent on China for rare earths, decides the strategic risk is too high and aligns with the U.S.-Japan initiative. Australia, which has been cautious about antagonizing China given their massive trade relationship, decides that long-term security trumps short-term economic gains. Malaysia and Thailand, seeing an opportunity to diversify their partnerships and reduce Chinese influence, sign on with commitments to develop their own resources. Within a decade, China's share of global rare earth processing drops from over 90% to maybe 60%. That's still a dominant position, but it's no longer a monopoly. American and allied defense industries have secure access to critical materials. The leverage China gained over the past 30 years begins to erode. The United States successfully demonstrates that strategic coordination among democracies can counter authoritarian control over vital resources. This is the optimistic scenario. It requires sustained political will across multiple administrations in multiple countries. It requires massive investment that delivers returns over decades, not quarters. It requires technological breakthroughs to make extraction and processing more efficient and environmentally sustainable. It requires luck, frankly, because any number of things could go wrong. But it's not impossible. We've seen similar transformations in energy markets, in technology sectors, in defense production during previous eras. Scenario 2 is what I'll call China retaliates and adapts. In this scenario, Beijing recognizes the threat that the U.S.-Japan framework poses and responds aggressively. They impose even stricter export controls, not just on rare earths, but on other critical materials where they have leverage. They accelerate efforts to lock up resources in Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia before American and allied companies can secure them. China has been making massive investments in African mining for over a decade. They've provided loans, built infrastructure, and established joint ventures that give them preferential access to resources. They could intensify this strategy, using their Belt and Road initiative to create exclusive supply relationships that make it difficult for Western companies to compete. Beijing could also use economic coercion against countries that join the U.S.-Japan framework. When Australia called for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, China responded with tariffs and import restrictions on Australian goods. They could employ similar tactics against Japan, South Korea, or any other nation that aligns too closely with Washington on rare earths. China might also accelerate development of substitute materials or technologies that reduce dependence on rare earths altogether. They've been investing heavily in research on alternatives to permanent magnets, different battery chemistries, and other innovations that could reduce the strategic importance of rare earths over time. If they succeed, the entire framework the United States and Japan are building becomes less relevant. In this scenario, the competition intensifies rather than resolves. We end up with two separate supply chains, one centered on China and one centered on democratic allies. Trade becomes increasingly fragmented. The global economy becomes less efficient but more resilient to disruption. And the risk of miscalculation or conflict increases as both sides view these materials as existential to their security. Scenario 3 is what I'll call implementation failure. This is actually the most likely scenario in many ways, because grand international agreements often fail not because of opposition, but because of bureaucracy, complexity, and competing priorities. Building new supply chains takes years, often decades. Permitting processes, even streamlined ones, involve environmental reviews, impact assessments, public comment periods, legal challenges, and political negotiations at local, regional, and national levels. A mining project that looks good on paper can get tied up in courts for a decade. Mining is also extraordinarily expensive. The capital costs for a rare earth processing facility run into the billions of dollars. The economic viability depends on consistent demand, stable prices, and technological efficiency. If Chinese producers respond by flooding the market and driving down prices, which they've done before, new mines and processing plants in allied countries become economically unviable. Private investors lose money. Political support evaporates. Projects get abandoned. The $550 billion investment pledge from Japan sounds enormous, but the details remain vague. How much of that is new investment versus projects already planned? Over what time frame will it be deployed? What mechanisms exist to ensure follow-through? We've seen plenty of big announcements that don't translate into actual construction and job creation. There's also the problem of political continuity. Trump might not be president in 4 years. Takaichi might not be prime minister in 2 years. New leaders could have different priorities. They might decide that maintaining good relations with China is more important than strategic independence on rare earths. They might face domestic pressure to focus on other issues like healthcare, education, or climate change rather than mining and defense. In this scenario, the Tokyo summit is remembered as a moment of good intentions that didn't lead to meaningful change. The United States and its allies remain dependent on China for critical materials. The balance of power continues shifting toward Beijing. And future historians wonder why democracies failed to address such an obvious strategic vulnerability when they had the chance. Scenario 4 is what I'll call broader realignment. This is the most ambitious scenario, where today's rare earths agreement becomes the foundation for a more comprehensive restructuring of economic and security relationships across the Asia-Pacific region. Imagine if the rare earths framework expands to cover other critical sectors. Semiconductors, where Taiwan currently dominates production and China is trying to achieve self-sufficiency. Advanced manufacturing, where supply chains are globally distributed but vulnerable to disruption. Artificial intelligence, where data, algorithms, and computing power are becoming as strategically important as natural resources. Telecommunications, where the battle over 5G equipment and network architecture has already demonstrated the security implications of technological dependence. In this scenario, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and potentially other democracies create something like an economic NATO for the Indo-Pacific. Not a formal treaty organization with mutual defense commitments, but a coordinated framework for supply chain security, technology sharing, investment coordination, and response to economic coercion. This would represent a fundamental shift from the globalization model that has dominated for the past 30 years. Instead of maximizing efficiency through globally distributed supply chains, the focus becomes maximizing resilience through allied supply chains. Instead of assuming that economic interdependence creates peace, the assumption becomes that strategic independence creates security. Such a system would be less economically efficient in purely financial terms. Products would cost more. Innovation might be slower because the pool of talent and resources would be smaller. But proponents would argue it's worth the cost because it reduces vulnerability to authoritarian coercion, and makes democracies more secure in an era of great power competition. There are major challenges to this scenario. India, for instance, has historically maintained strategic autonomy and is cautious about joining anything that looks like an anti-China alliance. Southeast Asian nations are economically dependent on China and don't want to be forced to choose sides. Even among close allies like Japan and South Korea, there are historical tensions that make cooperation difficult. But if current trends continue, if China becomes more aggressive in using economic leverage for political ends, if the security environment in Asia continues deteriorating, this kind of broad realignment becomes more likely. Today's rare earths agreement could be remembered as the first step toward a new economic architecture. So which scenario will actually unfold? Honestly, probably some combination of all four. There will be real progress in developing alternative supply chains, but it will be slower and more limited than optimists hope. China will retaliate in some ways, but not others, depending on their assessment of costs and benefits. Implementation will face serious challenges, with some projects succeeding and others failing. And there will be gradual moves toward broader coordination among democracies, but falling short of a comprehensive new system. The key variables to watch are implementation, Chinese response, political continuity, and regional dynamics. On implementation, are mining projects actually being approved and built? Are processing facilities coming online? Is the $550 billion investment from Japan translating into actual economic activity? We should start seeing concrete indicators within the next 12 to 18 months. On Chinese response, Beijing has been relatively quiet so far, which could mean they're still formulating their strategy, or it could mean they don't see this agreement as a serious threat. Watch for changes in Chinese rare earth policy, their diplomatic approach to countries in the U.S.-Japan framework, and their investment patterns in resource-rich nations. If they start moving aggressively to lock up supplies elsewhere, that's a signal they're taking this seriously. On political continuity, Trump faces significant domestic challenges. There's a government shutdown ongoing right now, with no breakthrough in sight. His approval ratings are mixed. The next election cycle is already beginning to shape up. If Trump loses political capital or fails to win re-election, support for this framework could weaken. Similarly, Takaichi is brand new to her role and hasn't proven she can deliver results or maintain support within her own party. On regional dynamics, the responses from South Korea, Australia, India, and Southeast Asian nations will be crucial. Do they see this as an opportunity to reduce Chinese leverage, or do they see it as an American attempt to draw them into a confrontation they want to avoid? Their choices will determine whether this becomes a genuine alternative to Chinese dominance or just a bilateral arrangement with limited impact. Let me also address something that often gets overlooked in discussions of trade and resources, which is the human dimension. When we talk about rare earth mining, we're talking about communities that will be transformed by new industrial activity. Mining has environmental impacts on water, air, and land. Processing rare earths involves chemicals and generates waste that must be managed safely. The reason China came to dominate this industry isn't just strategic planning. It's also because they were willing to accept environmental and social costs that other countries weren't. If the United States, Japan, and other democracies are going to build alternative supply chains, they need to do it in ways that are environmentally sustainable and socially responsible. That means stricter regulations, higher costs, and longer timelines. It also means engaging with local communities, indigenous populations, and environmental groups early in the process. Projects that ignore these stakeholders tend to face prolonged opposition and often fail. There's also the workforce question. Mining and processing rare earths requires specialized skills. Do we have enough geologists, chemical engineers, and skilled workers to staff these facilities? Or will we need to train a new generation of workers? Japan has an aging population and labor shortages in many industries. The United States has chronic skills gaps in technical fields. Building new industries requires building new workforces, and that takes time and investment in education. Another human dimension is the impact on workers in China. If this framework succeeds in reducing Chinese market share, there will be job losses in Chinese mining and processing facilities. Some of those workers live in poor rural regions where alternative employment is limited. I'm not suggesting we should prioritize Chinese jobs over strategic security, but we should be realistic about the fact that economic competition has human costs on all sides. Let me now talk about the Nobel Peace Prize nomination, because it's gotten some attention and it reveals something important about how leaders use symbolism in international relations. Takaichi's announcement that she will nominate Trump for a Nobel Prize was clearly coordinated in advance. Trump loves this kind of recognition. He's been open about wanting a Nobel Prize and has criticized the committee for giving the prize to Barack Obama early in his presidency. The nomination itself doesn't mean much in practical terms. Anyone can be nominated by qualified nominators, which include heads of state. The Nobel Committee operates independently and makes decisions based on their own criteria. Trump's chances of actually winning are unclear and depend on whether his various peace initiatives produce lasting results. But the symbolism matters. By framing Trump as a peacemaker, Takaichi is creating a narrative that serves both leaders' interests. It gives Trump prestige and validation. It positions Takaichi as someone who has the American president's ear and support. And it signals to other leaders in the region that aligning with Trump can bring rewards, not just costs. It's worth noting that Shinzo Abe reportedly nominated Trump for a Nobel Prize during his first term at Trump's request. The revelation of that nomination was embarrassing for Abe domestically because it looked like he was flattering Trump for political gain. Takaichi has learned from that experience. By making the nomination public and framing it as recognition of specific achievements, she controls the narrative and makes it look principled rather than transactional. The cherry trees that Japan is gifting to Washington next year work similarly. The original cherry trees, gifted in 1912, have become a powerful symbol of U.S.-Japan friendship. They attract millions of visitors every spring. They appear on postcards, in movies, and in countless photographs. By adding new trees for America's 250th anniversary, Japan is literally planting symbols of the relationship that will be visible for generations. These symbolic gestures matter because international relations isn't just about treaties and trade agreements. It's about how publics in both countries perceive the relationship. Americans who visit the cherry blossoms think positively about Japan. Japanese people who see their prime minister being honored by the American president feel pride in their country's standing. These emotional connections create political support for policies that might otherwise be controversial. Now, I want to spend some time on what this all means for the average person, because it's easy to get lost in geopolitical abstractions and forget that these decisions have real impacts on ordinary lives. If you own a smartphone, and most people do, the rare earths in that phone came from a supply chain dominated by China. If that supply chain gets disrupted or becomes more expensive due to geopolitical tensions, the cost of phones goes up. The same applies to laptops, televisions, and most modern electronics. If you drive an electric vehicle or are thinking about buying one, rare earths are essential components in the motors and batteries. The transition to clean energy that governments around the world are pushing depends on rare earth magnets for wind turbines. If those materials become scarce or expensive, the pace of that transition slows down and costs increase. If you're employed in manufacturing, particularly in electronics, automotive, or defense industries, your job security is tied to access to these materials. If companies can't get the components they need, production stops and workers get laid off. The $550 billion investment from Japan that I mentioned earlier could create jobs, but it could also lead to automation that eliminates jobs. The reality is usually mixed, with some jobs created and others lost. If you're a taxpayer in the United States or Japan, you're paying for all of this. Government subsidies for mining and processing facilities come from tax revenue. Military buildup in Japan comes from tax revenue. The strategic competition with China over rare earths and other resources requires sustained public investment over decades. That money could otherwise go to healthcare, education, infrastructure, or tax cuts. These are real trade-offs that societies have to make. If you're concerned about climate change, the rare earths issue is complicated. On one hand, we need these materials for renewable energy and electric vehicles, so securing supply chains helps the energy transition. On the other hand, mining and processing rare earths has significant environmental impacts. Balancing environmental protection with resource security is one of the central challenges of the coming decades. If you're a young person thinking about your career, the reshaping of global supply chains creates opportunities. There will be demand for engineers, scientists, technicians, and skilled workers in mining, processing, and manufacturing. There will be demand for diplomats, analysts, and policymakers who understand the intersection of economics and security. The skills that matter in this new environment include technical expertise, but also cultural awareness, language abilities, and strategic thinking. Let me address one more aspect of today's events that deserves attention, which is the role of personal relationships in international politics. The meeting between Trump and Takaichi wasn't just two governments interacting. It was two human beings sizing each other up, trying to establish trust, looking for common ground. The handshake, the body language, the tone of voice, all of these things matter in ways that are hard to quantify, but nonetheless real. Trump's relationship with Shinzo Abe was built largely on golf and personal chemistry. That might sound superficial, but it translated into real policy coordination. Abe was able to influence Trump on issues ranging from North Korea to trade to China in ways that purely transactional negotiations might not have achieved. When Abe passed away, Trump lost someone who understood how to work with him effectively. Takaichi is now trying to establish a similar relationship. She's doing it differently than Abe did. She's more explicit about the transactional nature of the relationship, with her emphasis on investments and specific deliverables. But she's also appealing to Trump's desire for recognition and legacy through the Nobel Prize nomination and other symbolic gestures. If she succeeds in building that personal connection, it could provide stability to the alliance even when disagreements arise on specific issues. The upcoming meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping in South Korea will be another test of personal diplomacy. These two leaders have a strange relationship. They've praised each other effusively at times, with Trump calling Xi a friend and a great leader. They've also attacked each other, with Trump blaming China for COVID-19 and imposing tariffs, while Xi has authorized policies that directly undermine American interests. Personal chemistry might matter less with Xi than it does with democratic leaders like Takaichi. Xi operates within a system where individual relationships are just one factor among many in decision-making. But even in authoritarian systems, personal relationships can create channels for communication, reduce misunderstandings, and potentially find room for compromise on specific issues. The question is whether Trump and Xi can find any basis for cooperation, given how far apart their countries have moved on fundamental issues. Rare earths are just one flashpoint. There's also Taiwan, where tensions have been escalating. There's the South China Sea, where China has been building military installations on artificial islands. There's technology competition, with both countries trying to dominate artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other cutting-edge fields. There's human rights, with ongoing concerns about Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and political repression in China. It's possible that Trump and Xi will find some narrow areas where they can make deals. Perhaps on North Korea, where both countries have an interest in preventing nuclear proliferation. Perhaps on climate change, where China has been investing heavily in renewable energy. Perhaps on some trade issues where compromise benefits both sides. But the overall trajectory of the relationship is toward competition and confrontation, and one meeting is unlikely to change that. As we think about where all of this goes, it's important to maintain perspective about the limits of prediction. International relations is inherently uncertain. Leaders change, technologies evolve, unexpected events disrupt carefully laid plans. A global pandemic, a financial crisis, a natural disaster, a domestic political upheaval, any of these things can reshape the landscape in ways that current analysis doesn't anticipate. What we can say with confidence is that the meeting in Tokyo today represents a significant moment in the ongoing competition between democratic and authoritarian models of organizing economies and societies. The United States and Japan are betting that coordination among allies, even with higher costs and slower progress, is preferable to dependence on an authoritarian competitor. China is betting that its scale, efficiency, and willingness to use economic leverage will preserve its dominant position. Both sides could be right in some ways and wrong in others. The most likely outcome is a prolonged period of competition where neither side achieves total victory, but both sides achieve some of their objectives. The United States and its allies will probably succeed in reducing Chinese market share in rare earths, but not eliminating it. China will probably face more constraints on its ability to use economic coercion, but will find other forms of leverage. The global economy will become more fragmented, with higher costs but greater resilience. For those of us watching these events unfold, the key is to pay attention to the details of implementation rather than getting caught up in the rhetoric of summits and announcements. Watch what actually gets built, not what gets promised. Watch how China actually responds, not what analysts predict. Watch whether political leaders in multiple countries maintain focus on this issue over years, not just months. The handshake between Trump and Takaichi today was warm and genuine. The agreements they signed have the potential to reshape global supply chains and reduce vulnerability to economic coercion. But potential doesn't equal certainty. History will judge this summit not by the words spoken or the documents signed, but by the actions taken in the months and years ahead. Whether we look back on October 28, 2025 as a turning point or as just another meeting depends entirely on what happens next. Thank you for your attention. I hope this analysis has given you a deeper understanding of what happened today in Tokyo and why it matters for the future of international relations, economic security, and the balance of power in the 21st century. The story is still being written, and we're all part of how it unfolds.